All right, so you've been welcomed. We're gonna get started. There, yay. So what I think you all heard this morning was an excellent overview of all the interrelationships and interconnectedness of the Earth, the whole planet. And we are part of that system. We are part of all of the ecosystems that are around us. We came from the Earth, and I think I'm gonna go back to the Earth someday in sometime, hopefully not too soon in the future. And really, native plant gardening, any kind of conservation and land stewardship revolves around what relationship that you have to the earth and how you understand the systems that are around you. And the better that you can understand them, the better that you're going to be able to be successful in whatever you're trying to grow in your own landscape. Whether it's just a little planter box in front of a townhouse, or it happens to be in a big neighborhood in a subdivision, or you happen to be out somewhere in a rural county, somewhere here in Virginia, and you have a 3-acre, 10-acre farm. All the principles about ecology and wildlife and interrelationships between plants and animals, they all apply, whether it's a small scale or a big scale. It's really not that hard to understand. It's just that everything, so I think people forget the complexity. And so the complexity is what makes our systems healthy and robust. And having redundancy, meaning having lots of different organisms and plants and animals that are doing some of the same types of systems approach inside their interrelationships. Having those redundancies is what's going to make it more likely that we're going to have diverse systems that are able to sustain and stay resilient in the future. So an ecosystem in general, what is an ecosystem? Well, ecology is life, so it's a system of life, and it's made up of two different primary factors, right? There's the things that are alive, that's the biota or the biotic part. So biology is bio is life, and the abiotic, meaning the non-living part. So your living plant animal communities make up part of the system, and the soil, the water, and the sunlight are the non-living components, the things in the environment that are sustaining the living components. And as they mentioned earlier, as Keith Tomlinson mentioned this morning in his keynote, where you have one, you have the other. It's not like they just arose out of nowhere. They all came from that geology, from the morphology, and the hydrology of the land, and all the different types of aspects of changes over time, glaciation, et cetera. So I'm not going to go into that huge history, but those systems are what drive all of the life pretty much that sustains us. And so I think it's important to remember that we need to be sustained. I hope that person was admitted to this session to sustain us. So hopefully everybody online is still doing okay. Okay, so we have all these systems, different ecosystems, and they're made up in different places. So you might have the ecosystem along the ocean side, you might have an ecosystem of the natural forest, woodland, Piedmont, where I live in Piedmont forest, the ecosystem of a wetland. These are all functional communities, assemblages of plant and animal communities. And the diversity of all those things, all in the aggregate, the genes, all the organisms, everything that's there, that's what we call biodiversity. So that's what forms all of the biology that's sustained on that land. And that's pretty much the larger landscape. And so we take that principle and apply it down into our own property. So the guiding principle of all this is that wherever you have diversity, you have stability. And that's just really important. If you have a diverse environment that's not a monoculture, so mono meaning one, such as a landscape where you saw in a film with Doug Tallamy, where you had a house with little meatball bushes and then you had lawn, right? So the meatball bushes are ornamentals, they're just decorations, they might as well be plastic. The lawn is a non-native plant that we put out there because we want our yards to look like carpeting. We want it to look like our living room, and we look out the window, or at least a lot of people do. I know in this room probably we're not so cool about that because I have some pictures of my yard. You'll see there's not a lot of grass in there. But those systems, that built system is not sustaining life. So in that turf grass, whether it's fescue or some other kind of grass, I mean, there might be some ants in there, or maybe a couple of beetles, a bird might kind of come in the yard and look for a worm and then leave or something like, it's not totally devoid of life, but it might as well be because it's not sustaining anything. There's no diverse number of plants, which are therefore not there to support the insects, which are not there to support the rest of the food web, which everything is connected, right? So our goal as habitat gardeners is to put in a native plant assemblage or community that maybe somewhat mimics nature. And the reason I say maybe and somewhat is because, let's face it, anything that we do as humans is really a garden. It's a construct. Okay, so the plants that Keith Tomlinson was mentioning, oh, this is a great plant, plant this tree or plant this one. It's like, well, that's just taking it out of context. That's like saying, this is a nice plant. This is like we're using this ornamentation and we're just sticking them in the landscape. So what we really want to think about is what is the plant community that would actually be living there on this land? And in this land, it probably would have been eastern deciduous forest, and even woodland. So it would have been oaks, and the associated shrubs and understory that go with that. So you can do whatever you want in your yard. I'm not here to tell you what to plant and what not to plant, but I want you to just think about the bigger picture and how you as an individual may not think that this tree that I planted here or that thing I put over there or my neighbor's tree down the yard is really that big of a deal. And maybe a few hundred years ago it wasn't, because there weren't so many of us. But when you take an aerial view of Virginia, or Northern Virginia particularly, where we are now, there's millions of us. And so millions of us have planted this plant and that plant and that plant. We have like this hodgepodge. One might even argue that it's a human ecosystem that we created, sort of like our own little system within a system. But nature is still all around us, and nature is what sustains us. So if we sort of forget and think we're separate from nature, that's probably in the long run not going to be beneficial for all of us. So if you can just remember plant diversity, it doesn't mean having a room full of one plant of 20 different species. That's not what it means. It means diversity across the landscape. So think of your home as part of a landscape, as part of a whole county. What am I doing to contribute to the landscape in my community, as opposed to, well, this is just my yard, I'm just gonna do whatever I want. It's a different ethic, I think. It just takes a different way of thinking about it. So that's the foundation of what we mean by conservation. If you want to conserve natural resources, you want to conserve the wildlife communities that depend on the plant communities, then we kind of need to put nature back. We need to put those native plant communities back into our urban developed landscapes in order to complement or augment the little bits of natural resource spaces that are still left. So we still have some natural areas left. Thank goodness we have places called parks, which I think we did that for our own benefit. But thank goodness some of those little microcosms of plant communities are still intact in some places. And one of the best things that you can do, whether you ever look at a plant list or not, whenever you get a handout like this, it's got a plant list, like here's a bunch of things you could plant. This is taken from a list across the whole state, right? That doesn't mean all of these plants occur in your area, but you look at the natural area nearest to you. So if you know of a natural area, maybe the Nature Conservancy has a little property somewhere near where you live, maybe there's a park near you could visit, take a walk in that community and see with your little pad of paper or on your phone, or however you take notes, what species do you see there now growing on their own, of their own accord, that nobody planted? That's what you could plant in your yard, because nature is telling you this is where we want to be. This is the kind of land and soils where we need to be. So the gardening part is the easy part, because then you get to select and pick and choose according to your budget too, of course. But as long as we're sustaining diversity, then we're supporting lots of other organisms as well. I've sprinkled some resources here throughout my presentation rather than saving them all for the end. I'm sure most of you have heard about Doug Tallamy. He's a scientist, entomologist at University of Delaware. He started out with his first book with Bringing Nature Home, which a lot of us intuitively already knew, but he finally encapsulated it in a way that people understood it. And in his original research, what he looked at was the predominance of native shrubs and non-native shrubs in different landscapes. And he had his grad students go out there and they basically took all of any little caterpillar that was eating on a plant in those yards, out of these like 25 different spaces that he looked at. And he compared and contrasted them. And what he found was a correlation between the non-native shrubs and the native shrubs. And the correlation was that the native shrubs supported substantially more biomass of native insects, specifically caterpillars. And he was focused on lepidopterans, so butterflies, moths, and skippers. And his research basically highlighted how it's important to have native species in our yard. And not only that, as he's mentioned in his little video you heard this morning, he also recognized that some native plants are even more productive for caterpillars than they are for other than other plants are. That's not to say that if you don't plant plants for caterpillars, that you're not somehow being a good native plant gardener. He was just focusing on productivity as far as birds, because so many bird species have been lost over the years. Our numbers are declining substantially. I believe there was I copied this down. In 2019. The journal Science estimated that the bird population in the US and Canada declined by 29% in the last 50 years, which is roughly equivalent to 3 billion fewer birds in quantity, the numbers. We still have a lot of species, but the numbers of the birds are declining. And not only that, in January 2021, there was a special issue of the Proceedings of the National. It was 3 billion fewer birds between in the last 50 years. And then in 2021, the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science released a special issue. And in that article, they documented Earth is losing 1 to 2% of insect population every year. And it's because of a variety of causes, of course, climate change, light pollution, agriculture, invasive species, and deforestation. So that wasn't enough. There's probably more. All that to say, if you use Tallamy's work and his lists, he's focusing on highly productive native species, but that's not to say that any species that aren't on his list just aren't worth it and they're not important, because as we know, everything is interrelated and interconnected. And so it's not like everybody should only plant oak trees and never plant anything else, because there's lots of other plants that we need. So I think it's just really important to understand each, whenever you read a book, just understand that they're coming from a particular perspective. And it's not the only end all to end all, right? There's just many ways of looking at it. And then later on, he continued with Nature's Best Hope. I haven't read Nature of Oaks yet. I understand that's really good. And then he partnered with Rick Dark to co-author a book called The Living Landscape, or like, how do we combine, you know, this landscape design ethic, and we want it to look pretty, and it's, you know, actually it's our yard and we want to go out there and enjoy it, not just have like a jungle back there, although I wouldn't mind a jungle. And Rick Dark talks about editing the landscape, where you go out and you sort of like take these things out, put these things in. So it's still a human construct, but it's much more in line with native plant community and sort of the ecological structure that would be there if we were not on the landscape. And Tallamy's most recent effort has been to establish something called the homegrown national park. You know, if we thought of all of our little tiny big yards and collectively added all of those thousands and thousands of acres, it could like come into, would be as much as another national park. So if we thought of our properties as being, again, connected to the larger landscape, then we can have a really significant impact on wildlife populations and you know, species in those food webs. So that's one resource. And then most of the content that I'm giving you today is really based on some fundamental best management practices. And the Chesapeake Conservation Landscaping Council has been around for over 10 years now. I've lost track, maybe 12 or 15. It's been many years since I first started in that organization. And it serves the Mid-Atlantic states in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. So it includes Pennsylvania, Maryland, Delaware, New Jersey, Virginia, West Virginia, all the states, New York, I think I left that one out, in the watershed. And it's a coalition of organizations who are all dedicated to pushing the market towards using conservation practices, whether that's in an urban or suburban setting, whether it's for the purpose of stormwater management or some other kind of conservation landscaping plantings. So the guidelines that were developed many, many years ago are still, the essential elements of conservation landscaping. I'm not gonna go through all 8 of them, but by the time I'm done, I will have probably touched on most of them. And I'm sure intuitively you already know a lot of these when you see these on the screen. So ChesapeakeLandscape.org, they have a conference every 2 years. They just had an awesome one in December. This one happens to be in Maryland next year. I'm not sure where they're gonna have it. And they also offer trainings and guidance for professionals. So along the way, we developed something called the Chesapeake Bay Landscape Professional Program, where, you know, it's hard for the average consumer to find somebody in the field who actually knows what they're talking about. So we had run into this issue where, you know, somebody would say, sure, I'll come in and put in a rain garden, and they had no clue what they were doing. And they would like dig a hole and line it with clay, and it become this like little wetland, and people were having mosquito issues, and like, oh, rain gardens are terrible. Like, no, that person just didn't know what they were doing. So this project, Chesapeake Bay Landscape Professional Program, was initiated to ensure that people who want to practice as conservation professionals have a credential that says, yes, I understand these principles, I know how to use them, I took an exam to be able to get certified, and now I can serve the public. So if you're looking for someone, either for yourself, or maybe you're in a homeowners association, maybe you're in a apartment community, or maybe you're associated with you know, your family member is at a school that has groundskeepers, and you're like thinking like, oh my gosh, these people don't know what they're doing. You know, you're seeing people like mowing all over the place, and well, try sending them to this website. Say, hey, did you know there's some training you can get? You can get certified in how to do these things, because if we don't make that connection between professionals, people who are in the field now doing landscape and maintenance, to understand how to do these principles, it's going to be a hard sell. So I highly encourage you to share this out with the folks that you know. So the primary principle, of course, for conservation landscaping is to use locally native plants that are appropriate for your site conditions. Your site conditions being, of course, the type of runoff you have, the type of soil you have, is it shady, is it sunny? Lots of features that you know about as a gardener. The word locally means different things to different people. Some people might think, well, locally means Manassas. Some people might say, no, locally is Prince William County. Some people say, no, local is, you know, Northern Virginia. And then other people might say, well, local is, you know, if you're looking at the whole continent, then local is the mid-Atlantic states. And to me, it's kind of like, well, yes, if you can buy plants where they source the seeds from your local county, start there. So up here in Northern Virginia, you know, there's Rotsonga, there's Hillhouse natives, but you know, sometimes nurseries will call themselves native nurseries, but they're getting their source from Pennsylvania or somewhere else. Now, it's not a bad thing if the plant ranges between Pennsylvania and Virginia. Then you're like, well, what's the problem? Well, let's think about that. In a northern climate of Pennsylvania, those plants are adapted for higher elevation or for cooler climates, whereas ours down here in Virginia are more adapted for humidity and heat in the summer, right? So you might buy a plant that came from Pennsylvania, northern Pennsylvania, and say, well, this is native to Virginia, I'm going to plant it here in Virginia, but the provenance of that plant was in a different part of the mid-Atlantic, so it might not actually survive so well in your garden. Like, well, I thought this was native, it's supposed to be okay here. Well, actually, it was locally native. Its genetic population was local to Pennsylvania, not Virginia. So I think folks who are outside of this community, the gardening community, they think we're being esoteric about, you know, whether it's native or not, or, you know, we're just being purists or something. But from an ecological standpoint, there is value to the idea that you want to try to source your plants from as locally as you can, and then proceed out from there. So I always ask when I go to a nursery, I specifically say, oh, I love this plant. You know, did you grow this locally? Did you collect the seeds here? They might say, no, I got this from North Carolina. Just so you know. So now you know. Okay. As far as definition, according to the Division of Natural Heritage at UCR, what is a native species? Native species are those that occur in the region in which they evolved, which means millions of years, right? And over geologic time, in response to specific physical and biotic processes characteristic of the region, the rainfall, the geology, the nutrients of the soil, et cetera. Climate, soils, drought, frost, and it's a big and in there, and their interaction with other species in the local community. So it's not just these plants evolved in this environment, but they co-evolved with all the other species that were evolving at the same time. And there's always a lot of ands in there. They co-evolved with the insects that were trying to eat them. So as Talmy described, you know, a plant had to like create these mechanisms in its genome to try to fight off anything from killing it, and the insects had to adapt, and so you have these interrelationships evolve over time. That's what we mean by locally native or native species. There's many ways to find native plants, lists, let's just say lists of plants that are known to be native to our area or beyond. So at the nativeplantcenter.net, that's where you can now access this original publication was Native Plants for Wildlife Habitat and Conservation Landscaping for the Bay Watershed. That book, I think you can download it if you look for the PDF of it. But if you do the, if you go to nativeplantcenter.net, basically you type in what you're looking for. Like I need a sunny plant and I want a flower, and it's in a dry area. And it'll kind of give you a list of here's some species that can work in there. That's for the whole mid-Atlantic. So that's going to give you plants that could grow in Pennsylvania or down here in Virginia, right? There's something called the Native Plant Finder of the National Wildlife Federation, nwf.org. And then on their website, you type in your zip code. And their list has been tied to ecoregion lists. So they're saying in this region of the mid-Atlantic, here's the list, here's plants that would occur in your zip code 22204 or whatever. More specifically, over the past at least 10, 15 years, many of us have been involved with the Virginia Native Plant Marketing Partnership, which was a statewide effort sponsored by the Coastal Zone Management Program, which is based at DEQ, and also supported by the agency I used to work for, Department of Wildlife Resources. We were the ones who established these regional native plant campaigns to say, hey, let's instead of buying plants from Pennsylvania or North Carolina, like what species would really be best to have in our area and that are locally available in the trade. Not just pick something off the list and go, well, I'd love to have this plant, but I can't find it anywhere, nobody's selling it. So it's kind of like your coffee table book that says, here, you're gonna plant something, pick it out of here, because we know that these are gonna be the ones that will work best here. So those are regional plant guides. And I believe they have some for sale downstairs at the one of the exhibits for the Northern Virginia guide. And all of those guides, the regional native plant guides of the Virginia Native Plant Marketing Partnership, were based on the science of the Flora of Virginia, which contains all of the plants of Virginia, including non-native plants, right? These are all the plants that would be found in the state. They're not just native plants. That's the plant atlas or the Flora of Virginia. You can download the app for like 25 bucks on your phone. So if you're outside in the woods, you're like, I wonder if this plant is native. You can try to look it up on there. What I like to do is I just use this. I go to the website, I type in the name of the plant, and I ask, you know, well, because I want to know when I buy something for where I live in Louisa County, would this actually occur in Louisa County? And so as an example, I've got a few examples here. So the first top two there, the bayberry. You know, bayberry is often recommended as an evergreen. Hey, put this in your yard, it makes a nice hedge, and it is. It's an excellent plant. It's evergreen. It's kind of hard to find native evergreen plants to put in your yard. But notice something, okay? Northern bayberry, which is easy to find in the market, its range really occurs eastern part of the state, southeastern part of the state. So those little red dots are telling you its ecological distribution. This is where it's ecologically found, where it actually would occur as extant or endemic in the landscape. Whereas the southern bayberry has a little bit broader range, but it's also in the eastern part of the state. You notice that bayberry does not occur in the western part of the state. So if you live in Blacksburg, is it going to be a huge problem for you to put bayberry in Blacksburg? That's a good question. That's up to you to decide as the purchaser. From an ecological standpoint, nature is saying, well, this is where this plant evolved. I'm not saying you can't plant it over in Blacksburg and that it won't grow over there. But we're saying if you want to plant plants that are in your native community, and you want to choose bayberry, you would choose one that's probably one that occurs to you. I live in Louisa County, which is sort of like, does not have a little red dot in it. I'm right on the edge. I'm like, well, it's okay if I put it, I might be introducing bayberry into my county because then the birds will spread the seeds, right? So then comes sort of that question of, to me, it's a philosophical question. Why are we here as a human species? I'm not really sure, but I know that we're part of nature. So there's a part of me, one part of me says, well, if I plant southern bayberry in my county, it doesn't occur there, and birds spread it, and then it does become endemic. Have I changed it? Have I changed the course of history by putting that plant there? I don't know. I do know that, as our keynote said this morning, you mentioned indigenous peoples and you mentioned the foods that they planted, right? So the squash bee, we wouldn't have squash bees here if indigenous peoples hadn't brought them up, squash plants from South America to North America. So there's the other part of me that says, we're part of the system. Our role is to move things around and change things. We're interacting with nature, and the reason grasses are so successful, i.e. corn and wheat and rice, right, is because humans have really been working with those plant communities for thousands of years. So I leave you with that esoteric question. It might be good to have over a cocktail with some friends and just say, what do you think? Should we be planting these things or not? Like me, I'm not sure. But when it comes to other plants, I've got the example of the mountain laurel, which is an interesting name. So it's called mountain laurel, but notice it occurs, its distribution occurs all over Virginia. And remember, this is just Virginia on the map. It doesn't mean that like these plants only occur here in isolation in our state. They just put our state in the maps in the flora of Virginia. There's a bunch of states around us, right? There's West Virginia, there's North Carolina, there's all these other states. So the range of mountain laurel probably goes pretty far, but in our state, these are the counties it's distributed in. And pinster bloom, the wild azalea, that occurs across pretty much every county there that I can see, other than way down there in Southwest Virginia. Whereas the great rhododendron is more of a mountain species. You can see it's in the upper elevations, the higher elevations of the mountains, the rigid valley. So that right there kind of tells you it's meant to be at higher elevation, probably not so much on the beach. Doesn't mean it can't grow at the beach or vice versa. But I just want you to be aware of the location of these distribution maps, because what they do is they speak to the population ecology, not just individual plants and organisms, but the whole population of the species and where they're distributed. And then there's some other plants that we have unwittingly introduced over the decades because we meant well. So I remember, 30 years ago, at the beginning of my career, everybody was saying, oh, purple coneflower is a wonderful native plant to plant. And I remember thinking at the time, like, I never seen it. Like, where is it? I've never seen it growing in Virginia. Where is it? Come to find out, well, it's native to the Midwestern prairies. And we do have prairies in Virginia, but we have our own different kind of coneflower species here that evolved here in the eastern part of the continent than in the western part of the continent. And as you can see, to answer my earlier question, the esoteric one about what are we doing to impact the environment? Well, apparently we've impacted it enough now that there's dots on this map that show that so many people have planted purple coneflowers, meaning well, it's not that we're bad, nobody's bad, it was no bad or good, it's just something that we did. But it is now basically becoming distributed in the environment. And maybe 1,000, 5,000 years from now, it'll just be part of the usual population of all the other plant communities that are out there. But again, if you want to know, when somebody hands you a list, be skeptical. It's just like somebody says, here, you should take these drugs. These are really good for you. It's kind of like, I don't know, there, ask my doctor, right? Go to the plant list and see where would this occur and if it's actually here. So all of that, those plant communities, once we think about plants as communities and populations, we know that they sustain wildlife populations and communities because they're all interconnected to those food webs. That's how we're going to provide healthy wildlife habitat, because of all the adaptations that different species of wildlife have to those plants that they rely on for survival. So, whether you're you know, on the bottom left, there's a crab spider. I'm pretty sure it's got that yellow and green color to it because it's adapted for being on some sort of plant that's gonna be camouflaged for, right? It wouldn't look good probably on a purple plant, some, you know, big purple flower or something. It's gonna be easy for something else to see it. So this animal is adapted for something specific. Just like the little bee in there in that picture, it's looking for a specific kind of pollen. The caterpillar, the frog species, you know, all these things are out there interacting with the other insects and plants in the area. So we're trying to think about this whole food web idea. So you might be wanting to plant for butterflies. That might be something you really enjoy. Like, I just love butterflies. I want to see butterflies. That's great. But remember, when you put those plants in that have the kinds of things, the flowers, the nectar sources that butterflies want, well, insects are going to want to come and eat them too. You can't just put a big piece of pizza out, you know, pizza pie in front of everybody and say, well, only eat the ones that have this, you know, just have that one. You know, everybody's going to want to come and sample from the pizza pie. So you put plants out there, they will come. And so if your, you know, grandchild is allergic to bees, and you planted flowers for butterflies, but you get bees there and you're worried about your grandson getting stung by a bee, you know, you can't have it both ways. So you build it, they will come. But I think that's a good thing. There are many resources out there. As I mentioned, National Wildlife Federation has resources. There's the Cornell Lab of Ornithology has tons of information about birds. There's the Xerces Society has tons of information about pollinators and butterflies. I didn't put all this on here. But a lot of those resources are listed in this Habitat at Home booklet. So if you go to Department of Wildlife Resources website and look for Habitat at Home, it has some websites on the back. So that's where you get your list of all these other resources that are out there. And everybody's linked to everybody else. So once you look up one thing in 3 hours, you'll realize time is going by because there's just so much out there. But these are just a couple of articles that I wrote. And if you're anybody in the room, a master gardener. Okay, so it's chapter 18 in the new handbook. This apparently is just we printed it again. So conservation landscaping principle is that we're designing. And I use the term designing loosely because not all of us are designers. You know, with a certificate in landscape design, I did not claim to be a designer. I kind of know how things should work for nature, but my idea of design is probably very different than most people's. I like it kind of loose and wild, and you know, the more jungly the better, but not everybody likes that. So, but in your space, whatever that may be, we're trying to uplift the environment. Now, notice. A lot of pictures that you're going to see in my presentation, other people's presentations, they always show all these really pretty flowers. But do they bloom all year round like that? No, everybody's showing you the pictures of what they look like in the spring or the summer when they're, you know, coming into their bloom. So this is just a snapshot in time. It's just saying at this particular point in time, at this garden in Charlottesville, it's called the X Art Park. I think that was Golden. Oh, Zizia, maybe it was Zizia aurea, was just gorgeous. And down along the sidewalk down there was like a little low-lying wet area, and they had a lot of piney, different things in there. And it was basically, that area was planted to evoke a sense of the riverine, of the stream that used to be in that area, but is now underground because they built all the shops and buildings around it. But it's designed to benefit that little bitty ecosystem or microcosm ecosystem in that area. So our goal is always to try to find it, so it's not just aesthetically pleasing to us, but it's also supporting nature. Ideally, low maintenance. There's never a garden, in my opinion, that's ever no maintenance, unless you are really willing to not do anything and only bush hog once a year, which some people do on their property if you have that kind of a property. Functional is subjective. That depends on you. What does functional mean to you? Do you want to be out there, you know, playing soccer in your yard, or do you want to be able to take a walk in the garden and have a meditation space? Like that's, how does it function for you is really about us and how we move through the landscape. And then the biggest part for me is capturing and treating runoff. So when I used to work for Conservation District up in Warrenton, that's what we did, was we would go out to visit people. If you ever need somebody to walk your property with you, or give you some advice about how water is running through your property, ask a conservation specialist from your local soil water conservation district. And wave your hand back there in the back, so.
We are Prince William's.
Prince William Soil Water District, so if you're Prince William, you have the education specialist to tell you what resources you can use. But when you look at your land, whether it's in your yard or parking lot, wherever you live, look and see where does water run off. Where is water coming into my property and where is it going off my property? And where it comes in, is it a pain in the neck? Is it always muddy there? It's always wet. I'm always trying to like mow over that. And it doesn't work because my lawnmower gets muddy. Well, do you have to mow that? Maybe you don't need to mow that. Maybe if it's a wet, low-lying area, you can put some plants in there that would like that kind of wet, low-lying area. Or better yet, you could just not mow it for a whole year and see what comes in there by itself. Because remember, nature is going to fill in a blank space. Nature abhors a vacuum. So if you have a blank slate, if you go out and clear the soil, something is going to grow there. In a lot of cases, it will be invasive plants because they like disturbance. But not always. Sometimes there'll be some little, like, my goodness, where did this plant come from? In my own yard, I remember one day I saw a wild petunia. Like I've been living in this property where I live in Louisa for 20 years. It's like, oh, there's a wild petunia here. Well, it came in because I've never mowed this area. I just kind of like leave it alone, let's see what happens. And somehow this little plant came back because that's what wants to be there. So try to work with water on your property. We'll come back to water as well. And basically, we're trying to mirror the patterns that we find in nature as far as what nature wants to do and how nature functions. So this is what we want to get away from. Okay, these are sterile landscapes that to some folks, this is very attractive because a lot of people associate the word maintenance with keeping a bare slate. Because I've had people literally tell me, well, if you're not maintaining your property, then it would look this way, like this is maintaining your property. And I don't know if that's $1 million house or not, but some people think, you know, I have $1 million house here. I need to show that I'm maintaining my property so people can see my house. And that is one way of landscaping and maintaining the land. But I would put to you that it is devoid of life. Nothing lives there. Okay, and there's this hedgerow here. When I first moved in, this is in my neighborhood, when I drive in. When I first moved into this neighborhood, that hedgerow was full of blackberries and greenbriers and all kinds of, you know, there's tons of birds going in and out of there. And this particular landowner, who I'm trying to get to know, is one of my neighbors. He's a nice guy. He loves purple martins. He has purple martin houses in his yard. So he does have purple martins. I don't know if they all get enough insects in the area, but you can see that the reason that looks like that is because that's been sprayed. The only way you can keep it looking like that is with herbicide. So he routinely herbicides that because he doesn't want, I guess, garbage growing on his fence. And that is a change. That is a change in how people perceive the landscape. So we want to try to bring back some more lush landscapes, I guess, basically. And this doesn't appeal to everybody. Not everybody wants a meadow or something. So if you can figure out a way to put like maybe a small bit of this, maybe a patch of this as big as one of these couple of tables put together, that's fine. Whatever you can do is fine. There's plenty of books out there about how to do this. So Claudia Wild and Thomas Rainier published this book several years ago. It's called Planting in a Post-Wild World. So Claudia's background is ecology. Thomas Rainier is a landscape designer, architect. So together they both designed sort of this rubric for how we can look at the land as layers of landscape. And that actually fits very well with how nature actually works. So you have ground coverage, you have the middle layer, and you have this other layer. So from a design standpoint, we're talking about the beauty and the aesthetics of it. You can take these landscape architecture concepts and apply them in ecological mind to creating design spaces that look nice, but that also support a diversity of wildlife and other species. So how that translates into in our landscape depends on your site. So this is just a little ranch house up in Pennsylvania, Connie Schmotzer's yard. And so she already had great big trees in the neighborhood and nothing else, right? So she put in some small trees. And so you're looking at layers right here. You're looking at the herbaceous layer and a shrub layer and a tree layer. And in her yard, which is really tiny, it's probably only, I don't know, 1/10 of an acre, she has applied those principles in a small scale. And that's where the action is at, that's where the life is. The leaf layer, I mean, it's technically called the leaf litter because, you know, the leaves fall down. To me, litter means trash, and I don't think they're trash. They're like gold. So leaves are the nutrients, all the nutrients that the trees take up and put in their leaves are supposed to get recycled back into the soil. The last thing we want to do is keep picking them up and taking them to landfill or throwing them out somewhere. You're basically robbing everything that's in the soil and all those organisms that rely on the nutrients from those leaves to live their lives out. So there's supposed to be a system there where those leaves fall and enrich the soil. And all these organisms that live there, think about the sow bugs and the millipedes and the centipedes and the beetles and all the little organisms that are living in there, the lizards that eat all those little insects, the snakes that come in and eat the lizards, right? Remember that little graphic this morning? All these little things are eating each other, the birds come down to eat the insects. There's a whole system just underneath your feet when you're walking through this area. So if you can leave leaves on your property, whatever, even if it's just one tree, you can just leave those leaves there and be okay with that and not mow around that. Not shred them up with your mower because there's organisms that do that. They're called shredders and decomposers that will do that for you. They'll gradually recycle all those nutrients back into the soil. That will be a way of bringing back some of the life. And when we think about that layer, it's not separate, like here's a layer cake, like here's the layer of leaves, and then there's plants, and then there's trees. There's the intergrades between them all, right? So in my own yard, as I said, like I don't have like a yard with lawn. I just kind of like experiment and see what comes in here. I have lots of plantains and things that just sort of come in on their own. There are some non-natives in my yard as well. But I've also tried to add like the maidenhair fern and the cinnamon fern and some other ferns in there that kind of are part of that lower layer. And I have all kinds of things moving in and out of my yard, like boxers sometimes. Ground covers and the herbaceous layer, they sort of meld together. So you've got things like phlox, and in this particular garden I have in the back, it's a wet area. So I had Tradescantia and turtlehead and some woodland phlox because it's kind of shady. And notice the ginger on the bottom right. So ginger grows very, very, very slow. And it's really reliant on ants, as he mentioned this morning. He sort of stole my little talking point. So I've had this little patch of ginger for a long time, and it's gradually migrating to other parts around the foundation around my house. It's cooler moist, because I like cooler moist places. So I noticed up against my little planting table that all of a sudden I saw ginger growing out of one of my planter bags. I'm like, well, how did that happen? How'd that get in here? I didn't put that in there. So, you know, the seed of the ginger plant has a fat body on it. This is a relationship, a mutualistic relationship between ginger plants and the ants. And the ginger says, here you go, here's a nice little bit of food for you. Wouldn't you like to eat this food? And the ant comes along and says, oh, this looks really tasty. I'll take this back to the nest. And they take it back to the nest and eat the little fatty part because that's what gives them energy. And lo and behold, they have planted the seed of the ginger. And that's how the ginger gets spread around your yard. So these are all interrelationships that we are maybe doing unwittingly in ants when we do this. So that next layer is herbaceous. This is where a lot of us think of gardens, because that's visual. We're very visual, and that's what we think of as the pretty part of the yard. Like this is where the flowers are. This is what I want to see. This is what brings me joy. And this is where a lot of the food and sustainability happens. You've got the insects coming in for the nectar, their seeds. There's a lot going on here. And that includes lots of different species. I just threw in a few pretty slides. I like, you know, wild senna is kind of a cool plant, but it's huge. You want the right plant at the right place. If you're looking for species specifics, there's plenty of plant lists that will give you some ideas of what species to list. I listed the genuses here, the genera. Okay, so the mints, the pygnathemums, the coneflowers, Rudbeckia, the bee balms, Leonarda, the milkweeds, Asclepias, the sunflowers, Helianthus, the phloxes, phlox genus, the asters, there's a huge, huge family, Cynthia trichum, the asters, the goldenrods, Solidago, and mistflower, Conoplynium. All right, if you're trying to pick plants, and you don't have a very big budget, you only have like a 10 by 10 space, pick from these. Whichever ones would occur in your county, wherever you live, according to the map that we looked at. Pick from these, and preferably pick the native species or the straight species, not necessarily cultivar, because a cultivar has the word cultivate in there, right? Native is a marketing expression based on cultivar. So cultivate means they found this really pretty purple coneflower and selected for that. They being horticulturists, they said, I think a lot of people would like this pretty purple coneflower. And so they selected for that and it became a cultivar of a rudbeckia or whatever. So you go to the store and you see like this huge, weird looking magenta thing that's like really wild looking, like, but it has different floral composition. And remember, insects like bees and flies, they see in different wavelengths. And so they're looking for specific little trajectories on the native straight species flowers, which may or may not be the same as the cultivar because you've altered the floral view of that plant. So that can sometimes influence what insects use. So that's just something to think about. Remember too that vines are an important part of that landscape. And these are just some examples. In my own yard, I use the trumpet honeysuckle, and I have seen the clearing moth. Hummingbird clearing moth uses the flowers in my yard, and then the caterpillar uses that as one of the host plants. They also use viburnum. So if you ever plant viburnum shrubs, you'll be supporting these little moths. We're thinking about year round. So if you're wanting to garden for a space that's going to be, providing something, try to plant things that are going to be starting to bloom as early as February or March, all the way into October. And if you select from some of those different groups that I showed you, you could have a whole, panoply of plants that there's always something cycling in, and then different insects coming in at different times. Because remember, bees emerge at different times of the year. They don't all just come out in springtime. They come out at different times during the spring. So each time they come out, they're coming out in concert with, or should be in concert with, the plants that are also coming out at the same time. Next layer is the shrub layer. So this is sort of in the in-between space now. So think of dogwoods and redbuds. Viburnums are really great. This one has like some sumac in it. The one in the upper left is I love Itea, the sweet spire and the sweet shrub. Those are also things that can be made into like little hedges instead of the typical, like burford hollows and stuff like that. And then above us is the canopy. These are the taller trees. Oaks are the powerhouse. So as you've heard earlier, 500 different species just of Lepidopterus. Doesn't mean other insects aren't using oaks, but specifically caterpillars are using those. And all of these are supporting nest structure. There's places for animals to hide, to get away from predators, to have the babies. There's a lot going on in the trees as well. So if we have all those layers, including evergreens, I love Juniperus virginiana. If you can plant the eastern red cedar, please put more of that in the landscape. I know it's not a small shrub, but the birds will use it in the winter time. So you've got bluebirds and robins and other birds that need a place to get out of the cold and the wind in the winter time. And especially if we do have a snow, it's going to provide some protection from the elements there as well. And don't forget to leave dead trees if you can. It's not going to fall on your car or whatever, or leave some lumber on the ground so that as the insects break that stuff down, we've got woodpeckers are going in there and using that. Water is an important feature in a habitat for wildlife, and that can take on many different forms. Some people might have the space and the budget to put in a huge water garden. This is one of those things with a liner and all the stones you bring in with a crane, and they've got a pump in there and a filtration system, and it's like they're out there all the time. It's like having a swimming pool, and you gotta really play with it and keep it up, right? Or you might just have what I got in my yard. This is the homeowners. This is the low budget one that I've got. I got one of those little bathtub things. I never did get a pump to circulate it. This is just behind my house, and every year I still get salamander eggs. And these are spotted salamanders. They come out in February when it's raining. So if there's a rainy night here, go out at night and look around your yard with a flashlight. You might see salamanders running across the yard, trying to find a pool of water to jump into and breed and lay their eggs. And I've also had marbled salamanders in my yard as well. So they got to have some water sources too, not just the frogs and the birds. Another important practice is to identify and remove invasive plants, which are defined as species that were intentionally or accidentally introduced by human activity into a region in which they did not evolve. And they cause harm to natural resources, economic activity, or humans. So, brown veg, English ivy, and porcelain berry, and, the Andina, and the list goes on and on. The Department of Conservation and Recreation has some new lists out. They just republished their invasive plant list. But a large percentage of these plants have been introduced through the trade because people like to buy plants and there's an industry to support that. And so we may even have plants now that we're planting, and we're not even realizing might be the invasive plant 50 years from now, right? Yes,
The butterfly bush is not a good idea.
that's correct.
Attract butterflies.
So butterfly bush is only providing nectar to the adult stage of a butterfly, but there are no insects that eat the leaves. It's not supporting the insect population. And because of its prolific seed source, and there's dozens of Buddleia species that are out there in the trade, they're getting spread into our natural areas. So, I remember seeing in Arlington, in one of the little county parks, there's like butterfly bush all over the sidewalk by the parking lot. So you want to be looking for alternatives that are going to provide nectar for butterflies, but that also something's going to be eating its leaves. Yeah. So it's really kind of cool. And the other thing to remember, you might be thinking, well, I have a nice autumn olive in my yard and it's not bothering anything. And, but actually autumn olive is producing berries at the time of year when birds need to be putting on fat for the winter. So they're eating sugar in the wrong time of year because that's a sugar source, not a fat source or a protein source. So when you look at a comparison between the berries that native shrubs and plants provide versus non-native shrubs and vines provide, it's not the same, it's not comparable. So just because the bird is out there eating that doesn't mean, like, people think, well, it's a good plant, my birds are eating it. Well, yeah, that's like junk food. They're really junk food if you give it to them. So look for the invasive plant species list from Natural Heritage. Blue Ridge Prism has a display downstairs today. They have wonderful fact sheets on all these different types of plants. If you have problems in your landscape, they have wonderful fact sheets online. Invasive.org has a ton of links to other links. So these are just a few of the top ones. And then the last part really is basically managing. How do you manage your landscape? It's not non-management. You're going to be in there trying to sustain, if you have non-native plants coming in or so-called weeds, and weeds are pretty subjective as well. As far as I'm concerned, if it's a native plant, it's not a weed. If it's an invasive plant, then it's a weed for me. You might need to prune from time to time. You might not like in the wintertime how it looks. I really highly encourage you to try to keep everything standing until the end of February. That's why I put this picture on the front instead of some, beautiful landscape yard with the green carpet in the front, because these look like dead plants. Like, yes, and they have a purpose in the wintertime. That's where a lot of the little eggs and of the insects are laid and the spiders are laid. They're out there. I know I got to stop soon. So keep the dead plants standing, but if you have to cut them, like if it's blocking your, like I have to cut this, my neighbor's gonna really get upset with me, then cut them and try to stack them, stack those stems somewhere, keep them on the property because something is bound to try to emerge out of that later on in the spring. I have a lot more information about soil damage, try not to disrupt the soil, try not to compact it. Be mindful of all of those organisms that are under the ground that really need to be protected. And then looking at how water runs off the site. So we're trying to maintain the site in such a way that it will absorb the water. So we call that infiltration, how the water will go down into the land and how the water runs off the land. So it's kind of like this dynamic between water flowing on the land and off the land. If we could keep water on site, which is kind of counterintuitive because most people don't want any standing water on their property, but we're trying to keep the water on our site so the plant will suck it up and it doesn't run off onto the land, then we'll be okay. In our urban and suburban landscapes, the more impervious cover we have, meaning sidewalks, pavement, roofs, roadways, where water cannot get down into the ground, the greater amounts that we have of that, the more the downstream impacts are, because that means water is just able to flow off really fast and has nowhere to go. It can't go into the ground, and it flows away. And with it goes all of the, you know, the little soil particles from any bare soil that might be in around the area, and then all the stuff that comes off of our vehicles and the roads, people walking their dogs, not picking up the stuff afterwards. And fertilizer people put on the yard, like not all that stuff goes into the ground, it runs off into our water and ends up in our streams. So ultimately, conservation landscaping is about making our built environment function like a system that nature would be, doing its interactions. So here are some examples of how you would do that with plants, with native plants. You basically create a buffer around ponds or stormwater management areas. Instead of mowing down to the edge of the water, which also attracts Canada geese and lots more manure, plant plants around the edge and don't mow to the water's edge. If you have a slope, why try to go up and down the slope when it's a steep slope with a mower? It's kind of dangerous, you know, put some grasses on there. It doesn't have to be mowed if you're not using it. Drainage areas, people mowing drainages all the time, like why? You're not gonna walk in there, like let some nature grow in there. Rain gardens are a construct, there's a whole science to that, but basically it's capturing the water, filtering it, and making sure that there's no standing water after 48 to 72 hours. It's not a pond, it should not be a wetland. So actually the plants that go in there are not wetland plants, they're plants that like it occasionally flooded and most of the time dry. So that's pretty much in summary. We want to know, what does nature do? Nature abhors a vacuum and wants to fill in bare spaces, so keep your ground covered, keep the leaves on the ground, allow your native plants to self-seed, try not to disturb the soil, which will bring in more invasives. Plants grow in communities, not by single little plants, so therefore try to grow in groups and clusters and layers. Use several species that would be in your area and try to let them complement each other. We're always building our soil. We want to enrich the soil, not take away from the soil. So leave the leaves on the ground. They're not litter. And just try to remember that we are part of that living system. It's always changing. So your garden is not going to stay the same for 10, 15 years if you live there that long. Allow that to happen. Let's see what happens, see what nature brings in there, and be willing to edit a little bit over time. So thank you so much. I really appreciate it.